Well, it's 10 o'clock. We've got much to do. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, thank you for this beautiful fall day. Thank you for the changing leaves, the changing seasons, as they serve as a reminder that the one thing that never changes is you, and you are always in control. Guide us as we go through the study today. Bring this story to life for us and take us into a new and deeper understanding of you, God, so that we would know and love you more. It's in your Son's precious name that we pray. Amen. Well, this is the week we're finally starting battle, and instead of starting with chapter 6 and the fall of Jericho, that oh so famous story, we're gonna talk about an icky topic that a lot of people don't like, and I just, why not tackle it head on? And that is this whole idea of war and killing in the Old Testament, and that mean God in the Old Testament versus that sweet Jesus that's so cuddly in the New Testament, and kind of call it out for what it is. It can kind of serve as an elephant in the room sometimes. So I thought we would go ahead and just deal with it straight on. We've done some research and brought in some commentaries to try to understand what's going on as we dive into all of these conquest stories, which the book of Joshua could kind of get a bad name because it's of all this war. But really, the battle stories just go from chapter 6 to 11. There's a whole lot more that happens in Joshua than just battle, but it can kind of get a bad rap because this is where the conquest is, the taking of the land. And so we'll kind of deal with that up front. People ask this question, because they look at Jesus first, how could a loving God put out the order to kill an entire people group, take their land, and they're just minding their own business? And so let's break it down. Let's look at the people, let's look at the land, and let's look at what God actually said. So let's start with the people. Who's in this land right now? We actually first hear about them in Genesis chapter 15. God is cutting covenant with Abram. We're not even Abraham yet. And he tells Abraham, when he's talking about the land grant that his ancestors, that his descendants will get, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So there's already something wrong in this land. There is sin going on. And I can't help but look at that and think about the story of Noah and how it was an entirely sinful people save this one guy, this one family, and a whole flood comes through. But we do have this one guy that's held back. So we've got this whole people group where there's apparently a problem. Now, you may notice that he calls them Amorites instead of Canaanites. Like Canaanites, it is a generic, overarching term. There were lots of different people groups that were in here. We refer to them as a whole as Canaanites. Even further back, they just referred to them as a whole as Amorites. But you can break them down into even smaller groups. So we already got the hint that something's wrong just from Genesis. And then we get to Leviticus, and you get to the part of Leviticus that talks about the moral laws or the holiness code, where you start listing out all these things, all these sins, lots of sexual sins, some child sacrifice, of which there was quite a bit of it, by the way, killing your child and sacrificing them to a little god. There was a lot of that happening. And so when we get those laws in Leviticus of, do you see what they're doing over there? He's saying, do you see what they're doing over there? I don't want you doing that stuff. I am a holy God. I'm calling you to be my holy people, and you can't do those things and be holy. So we've got a major sin problem going on over here in Canaan. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 4 through 5, Moses is talking to the people, and I love this because we have a tendency to think that we've done something great when something good goes our way. He says to them, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, talking about when it's time to take the land, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going in to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a sin problem here that's been going on for generations. If it was going on before Abraham and it's still going on at the time of the Exodus, it is prolific. And you need to move immediately from there into what is this land anyway, and why this land? And there's this fascinating term that Becky and I came across as we were discussing this that describes this land, and the word is, and then I'll spell it before you ask, umphalos. Umphalos, O-M-P-H-A-L-A-S. And it quite literally means your navel, your belly button. That is how the word translates specifically. And it is this idea of it is where the divine and the secular meet. And that is what God has proclaimed this land to be, an umphalos, a place where the holy breaks through, infiltrates, and connects to the earth. There's actually a place in the Bible that I never caught this word before because it's just like a high hill. Y'all, our language is so incomplete. At Mount Gerizim over here as an umphalos, but you completely miss it when you read that passage. And I never caught it before until somebody says, you can specifically find the word in Judges, and I went looking for it, and I went right past it. But it's what all of Canaan is. It is what the temple will eventually be when they finally move in and build the temple. It is what this space is. God has deemed this to be the place where he connects with his people. And remember that the Israelites, his whole goal for them was not for them to be insulated. The whole world was meant to be blessed through them. So keep that in mind as we move forward. They were never meant to be isolated. Consider also what this land was used for. This is an agricultural land. This is an agricultural society. So when we talk about war and battle, there is no room in here for prisoners of war. There is no room here for taking people and keeping them in a prison. When you work in agricultural society, everyone must be productive. There is work to do, there are mouths to feed, and there is going to always be work. You don't have people who can not work the land in order to be a prison guard. Everybody works. And so the closest you could get is indentured servitude, slavery, and there is some of that happens in our Bible. And in fact, there are lots of rules that God lays out throughout Exodus and in Deuteronomy that talk about how you are to treat a slave, of which I would argue there's a whole other topic there because the definition of slavery for us looked different back then. So we can get into that at some other time. Maybe I'll have some time to research that. But slavery was a different situation back then. But God called them to treat their slaves well, to treat their servants well. And he will almost always, when reminding them of this and laying down these rules of what you don't do to your slaves, he'll say, because you were a slave. Remember that you were once in that situation and I rescued you. Treat them well. Some would even argue that God never really wanted his people to keep slaves in the first place. But that's, again, whole other topic for a whole other week that we don't really have time to stop off for. So it's an agricultural land. It's an umphalos. This is the promised land. God owns this land. We kind of covered that in the first week. It's all God's. This isn't Canaanite land. This isn't Phoenicians' land. This is God's land, and he can give it to whomever he deems fit. And we might as well talk about the fact that eventually he deems Israel unfit. They do buy into the worship of smaller gods. They do commit the atrocities, and he does eventually boot them out of their land, his land. The northern kingdom is carted off by the Assyrians. We never hear from them again. The Assyrians actually insert a different people group in there, which, as I think about it, sort of sounds like a suzerain vassal agreement, because there are land grants involved there. And the Israelites kind of get all mixed in with them, and they're kind of Samaritans in Jesus' time. But the Israelites, as they looked in the northern kingdom, we never really hear from them again, so to speak. And then in the southern kingdom, they get sent into exile in Babylon. So he boots them all out. Now, eventually a small remnant comes back. They rebuild the temple. It's much lesser than the original temple. But he even deems his own people unfit to be in his land. And he sends them out and allows others to come in. So it's God's land. He can kind of do what he wants. And speaking of suzerain and vassal agreements, he did make an agreement with them. Recall that they were pulled out of Egypt. They are refugees. They do not have a homeland. They've really been kind of nomads since Abraham's time when he was called out of Ur and sent on his way over. So finally, for the first time since the first covenant, God's people are going to have land. A suzerain and vassal treaty, you have the greater party who has all the land and all the military and all the power will make these agreements with a smaller people group that says, I'll protect you if you stay faithful to me. And it can look a lot of different ways with taxes, or if I go to war, you're going to come fight for me. But usually one of the things the suzerain promises is protection and a piece of land. So God has that agreement with our Israelites, and this is the land he promises them. So it's his land. He gives it to his people in a treaty. It's a land grant. He can do what he wants, but this is what he has deemed to be the place where he will connect to this earth, the Umphalas. It's a fun word. You got to say that one. Omphalas, Umphalas. And I'd never heard that word until last week, and it's fascinating. So that's who our people are. That's what the land is. Now, what did God really say when he said, go in and take the land? We have to look in, it's in a few different places, but we're going to zero in on Deuteronomy chapter 7. Starting in verse 1, he says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you the many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally, make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. That feels kind of straightforward, doesn't it? Well, there's a Hebrew word hiding in there that I'd never heard before until last week. I stand on the shoulder of giants, lots of them, as a very small person. The word is charim or charim, and it is H-E-R-E-M. Or you can put a C-H at the beginning, C-H-E-R-E-M. And be careful when you're searching around for that one on the internet because it also has to do with nostrils. But in this situation, belly buttons, nostrils, the Hebrew language is fascinating, is it not? Okay, so we have this word, charim, or charim, and it has 2 definitions. One is most clearly military. You march in, you kill them all, you burn it down. That's definition number 1. The second definition is more of a cult definition, and it is about dedicating everything to a deity. Well, that sounds interesting. Some will even say it's specifically surrendering something to God, which often meant devoting it to the service of God, or, yes, putting it under destruction. But if you are devoted to the service of God, it seems like there might be a loophole there. If you are devoting to the service of God, there maybe is room for something else, maybe assimilation, which in this day and age is an ugly word, but back then it is not. Assimilation is something that happened quite a lot, and it is what happened to our northern kingdom with the Assyrians. They assimilated, they went way past assimilation. But anyway, consider Rahab. If God really meant for them to wipe them all out, why allow for Rahab? And not just allow for Rahab, we find her in the line of Jesus. There's something more here, isn't there? I argue that there is a choice. And if you really work your way through Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, all those books that can kind of get difficult to trudge through, along with Joshua, you will find that there is another option here than just total destruction with this dedicating things to God. So you can choose to call on Yahweh as the one true God, or you can be destroyed. There is an option. And as we work our way through Joshua, we are going to find that there are actually only 3 instances where they march in, kill everyone and everything that breathes, and burns it to the ground. There's only 3 of those instances. And by the time we get to the end, to me it feels as though they serve as something of a symbol to the rest of the land. Because remember, at this point we already know multiple times that the kings of these areas in Canaan, their hearts were melted in fear. They knew who the Israelites were. They knew their God was stronger. Rahab knew it too, and she made a choice, and God honored that choice. So there's only 3 places that we get these types of battles in Joshua. And in every other battle, you're going to see this interesting theme. You're going to get to the end, and it's going to say that Joshua destroyed them entirely, and then you're going to hear about survivors. What gives? It's meant to place in your mind the idea of cleansing the land. So remember our word umphalas. Remember that God is going to come here and reside with his people in his land. Remember in Leviticus, if you've read through it with us, about purification, cleansing, and how God cannot be where there is sin. The land must be set apart for God. The land must be sanctified for God. So we have these 3 cities that are completely destroyed. Jericho is one of them, Ai is another, and Hatzor in chapter 11 is the other. And we will talk about those battles, and it's still going to be tough to read. But there is a purpose being served here, and there are many survivors. There are many survivors. And even with those survivors, you're going to get that tagline that there was total destruction, but there wasn't. There wasn't. There is some symbolism, I feel like, going on here. Maybe symbolism isn't quite the right word, but there is still the setting apart of the land while leaving room for people to assimilate into the Israelite culture, become a follower of Yahweh, and be cared for and protected. If you read through all these places, I feel like you do get the options of you can leave, you can assimilate, or you can die or become a slave. And there's a bit of a difference. There's a 3-class system we're starting to find that existed there of Israelite citizen, and then maybe something in between that and a slave situation. So there was room for assimilation. There was room to just be a slave. But the word harem is used often through these stories. It's used a lot in Deuteronomy. And God is saying that ultimately, what he doesn't want his people to do going into this land is buy into their method of worship. Don't buy in to their little gods and their sexual sins and their child sacrifices. These things are all detestable. That is the word God uses. These things are detestable to me. Don't allow them to change you, because it actually, on the heels of saying to destroy them utterly, he goes on to say, and don't intermarry with them. Well, if we destroy them totally, why do we need to worry about intermarrying with them? Which they end up doing anyway, and we have a whole other set of problems and eventually exile. But I argue that our English language is lacking in translation. Consider the word love. Consider how our Bible uses the word love, and how woefully short it comes when you start hearing about all the other Greek words for love, all the different levels of love. I say our English language comes woefully short to really getting across the message of God, which is that ultimately he wants everyone to believe and follow him. So as we talk about war and we talk about battles, remember, they knew who the Israelites were. They by then knew who God was. There was a choice. And we have to use a big word here. We have to watch our ethnocentrism. We have to watch that innate subconscious act that we all do from one time to another where we think our way is better. And especially in Western culture where we are by and large in a safe, free land where we don't conquer each other's territory. We have boundaries, we have a government, we have United Nations, things. We don't think about conquest. We don't think about going and taking someone's land. But when you're in ancient Israel times, I hate to say it, but this was par for the course. So you have to watch that tendency to say, oh, that word assimilate is awful. Oh, I can't believe they're taking their land. You have to recognize that our way of life is wonderful. It just isn't what they were dealing with back then. It was not just the Israelites. That doesn't make it right or wrong. I'm just saying this was the way of life back then. If you wanted land, you could make a treaty with someone, or you could take it by force. Now, this is God's land, so it's different here, but we should be careful to not judge what we don't fully understand. Just as we cannot ever think as high as God. God's ways and God's thinking is higher than ours, and we will never fully comprehend it. So we cannot fully comprehend something we were never there for and never experienced. So these are things to keep in mind as we talk about military conquest and as we read these difficult stories where the Israelites went in and killed the youngest and the oldest and all the animals. It's still tough to read, but we must keep these things in mind. And one other thing that comes on the heels of this is, how is the God of the Old Testament different than our Jesus in the New Testament? And to that I would say, God has never changed. I can show you story after story in the Old Testament of God's grace and love. It is evident in the story of Ruth and Boaz. It is evident in the story of Hosea and Gomer. It is evident in the fact that God rescued the people out of the land of Egypt, cared for them, provided for them before they ever had a discussion about commandments. God is still gracious and loving, even in the Old Testament, just as his righteousness and holiness is just as evident in the New Testament if you look for it. I think every gospel account, except maybe John, Jesus talks very candidly about end times, and he does not mince words about what happens to those who do not proclaim God is the one true God. And if you don't like it, what you see in the Old Testament with conquest, you're really not going to like what you read in Revelation. Can I give you an example? Just for funsies? I'm going to look at Revelation chapter 14. And I'm going to start in verse 14. And then we're going to move into Joshua chapter 6. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had a charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because the grapes are ripe." This is where it gets rough. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them in the great winepress of God's wrath. And they were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which, by the way, is about the size of the Holy Land. Interesting side note.
180 miles.
So, if you don't like what we're about to get into, stop at 3 John, Jude. Stop at Jude in the New Testament, because it gets kind of rough there too. God never changes. God is the same, and there are still stories that are tough to read. Nevertheless, here we go. Before I move into Joshua chapter 6, do we have any questions? Any thoughts, concerns, Hebrew words to share? All right. Well, the time has finally come. All this waiting, and it's time to enter.
If you ain't ready, you better get
Well, the time for them to take the land has finally come. So I'm going to read a good chunk of this, but I think it's good to hear again before we really break it down. So starting in verse 1, and again, I'm in NIV this go around. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding, but Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. Now we're finally going to kind of push ahead, rush forward. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are in her household should be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into the treasury." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. And we will pause there. There's a lot just in there, and I read all the way through it because you kind of get the instructions and then it's actually carried out, and you need to cover it all. So it's time to take the land finally. He most definitely gives Jericho over to the Israelites, but I love how he opens it. Like, they've barred the gate. These walls are thick. I gave you the land, do you see? And I'm just like, it looks pretty locked up to me. This is no easy feat for your average army. However, this is God's army. This is going to be different. God has a plan. So he says in verse 2, "See, I have delivered them into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." And then we get these specific orders. All the military men are to march around the city once a day for 6 days. And on the 7th, we march around 7 times. We get the order in a strange order. So you have an army, a heavily armored group going first, then 7 priests blowing trumpets, then another set of priests carrying the ark, and then a rear guard behind them. So the ark has soldiers in front of it and behind it, and our priests are in the middle. And we kind of move slow in the narration at first. We're being very specific about going around the city, and we go for 2 days, and then suddenly we ramp up. And you'll notice when he gives his instructions, and Rahab specifically mentioned, She did her part. We need to make sure we do ours and take care of her and her family. And you see in the narration, we'll skip this part, but she's actually taken to the area outside the camp. This is what we would know to be the unclean space. If I had to guess, her family has to be circumcised before they're actually brought in, and it's going to be a whole big ordeal. But first, they'll stop out. They're still saved. They are taken to a safe space. And then they come into the family of God. We see her in the line of Boaz. We see her in the line of Jesus. So that is honored here. And then we get in verse 17 this warning. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. And we'll keep Rahab safe. And he says in verse 18, but keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to the destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. And so we got to set these things apart. We're getting this whole idea. We talked about the meaning of the word cherem and the cult meaning about being devoted to God. These items are devoted. They are his now. They are set apart and we don't touch them. When you look at... We get this idea of devoted things in Leviticus chapter 27. It says, but nothing that a person owns and devotes to the Lord, whether a human being or an animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed, bought back. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord. So these are his things now. They are holy. I don't know that touching them is tantamount to going into the temple and touching the things in there, but it's definitely his. In his treasury, it's not for the Israelites. Remember we talked about how Jericho is completely wiped out and it is marked as God's, so everything in it is God's. This city is not for just anyone. This city is for God. So there's a lot just in this story, really, just in this part, and we haven't even finished it. So the cities back then were rather small. Maybe 600 meters in circumference. So the Israelite army is large. It's entirely possible that when they're marching around for the day, the front half of the army is back in the camp resting by the time the last of them get there. They're a big group, and this is not a large city. That circling around, as I was looking through my commentaries, this interesting little thing came up that you might remember Becky talking about, I think on week 1, about territory exchanges and walking the land and then you trade your sandal. Well, we didn't trade a sandal here, but we certainly traded some land, didn't we? So this commentator brings that up and he talks about the walking of the land. He says the widespread custom of laying claim to a territory was done so by tracing out its bounds. Such circulatory marches often formed part of the ceremonies at the installation of kings. That one was new to me. We definitely install a king here, don't we? So we get that walking around and then we get the taking of the land. And it wasn't one of the fascinating things about this story, and one of the things that really sets apart Jericho, is the fact that it wasn't just military men walking around the city. This is the only battle I can recall reading in the Bible that includes priests. And I could be forgetting something. I fully admit I do not know my Bible back and forth. There are priests in this battle. There are priests walking this city. What are they doing there? Who takes priests to a battle? Well, God does. And you get this fascinating number that keeps popping up, this 7 days. 7 days. I feel like I've heard this before in the Old Testament, 7 days. Something significant happens in 7 days. I feel like it was in Genesis. It was creation, wasn't it? God created the earth in 6 days, and on 7th day, he what? He rested. And if you've dug into your Hebrew at all, you have found that the word rested is not a definition this big. This is not my Sunday afternoon nap. This is a much bigger thing. The 7th day is when God takes the throne and he rules and reigns over the earth. This is when his kingdom begins, truly begins. So they circle the city for 6 days, and I had this concept brought to my attention a while back regarding the plagues of Egypt. And if you notice how the plagues start in the water, and then they move to the crawly things, then they move to the things of the air, and then eventually the firstborn, God decreated Egypt before he took his people out. I would argue perhaps God is decreating Jericho in these 6 days. And on the 7th day, he yanks those walls down and he enters in. He takes his rule, and it stands as something of a symbolic place for the rest of the land. The other kings saw what happened at Jericho, y'all. This is not an isolated incident. Everybody knows what happened at the Red Sea. Everybody knows what happened at the Jordan River, and everybody knows what happened to Jericho by the time they leave. This is our first city fully committed to total destruction. It was specifically cursed by Joshua, we'll see in just a minute, to never be rebuilt. It is devoted solely to Yahweh. The Israelites do not stay here. They do not build a city here. They do not take the things out. This is God. This is why he was at that battle in the ark. This is why the priests are there. And this is why I would argue this is the only true, actual holy war battle, in my opinion. Because you've got the presence of God in the priests. Not that God wasn't with them as they went, but when you talk about holy war, you have to be awfully careful about ending up in a situation like the Crusades where you use the Bible for your opinion and benefit as opposed to God literally leading the way into battle. Very different situation. We also have in here trumpets. Now, trumpets were not unusual on the battlefield. Military men blew them to sound victory, halt the battle for various different reasons. But here our priests are blowing these trumpets. They're blowing them all along the first 6 days, and everybody else is to be absolutely quiet, not a peep. And then on the 7th day, our priests are blowing the trumpets loudly. And when they give the long blast, then our people shout. And we know God is with them, and God is in the middle of it and behind it. What must that have sounded like? When those trumpets hit full blast and all those men shouted and God is in the midst of that, talk about a heart melting. That had to have been an awe-inspiring moment if you weren't just running in terror for your life at the sound of that. What must that have sounded like? And we actually see trumpets really prominently in another place in the Bible. We see it in the end. When Jesus comes back and we get those trumpet sounds and he is entering not into Jericho, but into all of the earth. The Umphalas gets a lot bigger at that point, right? He is entering all of the earth. And at that point, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess on earth, under the earth, in the heavens, that Jesus Christ is Lord. So Jericho can kind of call to your mind Revelation. Okay, we're going to pick up and we're going to finish out our story. I'm going to skip down to verse 24. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute. Poor Rahab. Every time they say her name. Rahab the prostitute. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: "Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest, he will set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. We end this whole story with this lovely curse. The city is entirely God's. Again, our first of 3 instances where that full definition of harem is utilized. This city is God's. It is consecrated by fire, and it is to not be built ever again, lest your children die. God brought down this city. He did not give it to the Israelites. It is his. But if you've ever been to the Holy Land, you know Jericho's there. It was rebuilt. In fact, it was rebuilt many times. Jericho has a tough time. When we were there, we saw the dig site of the walls, and it's been abandoned. This dig site is from like the 1950s, and we were all trying to figure out why the wall was still there. We didn't know our Bible super well. It got rebuilt in 1 Kings chapter 16, when King Ahab, the guy who married Jezebel, when he was around, this guy named Hiel of Bethel, he rebuilt it. And it did cost him the life of his firstborn and his youngest, but he rebuilt it. It later got savaged again. It was rebuilt again. Herod the Great actually died there in 4 BCE, and it was there. And I think it was maybe torn down again after that. It has a rough history. In fact, the Jericho we know today is about a mile south from where it originally was. And the walls we saw are not these walls from chapter 6. Of course, we know that because when he leveled those walls, it was not a falling in or a falling out. It was leveled. Those rocks are gone anyway. But that wall we saw when we were there in Israel is not the wall that God took down. Jericho has a tough history. But, I mean, Joshua levied a curse, and clearly God is backing that up because it has a tough time sticking around. So this is the story of Jericho. This is the story of the first conquest, the first city that is fully devoted to God of our 3. There's, as I was looking through commentaries, I was fascinated that somebody read the story and wrote a poem. This is from way, way, way back in time. A guy named Paulinus of Nola. And I was just fascinated by this. And it's an interesting poem. So we'll close with the poem and then any questions, of course. Human salvation is useless and my strength lends me no strength if I lack the strength of God. What good was the boundless vigor of giants or the kings of Egypt or mighty Jericho? Their own inflated glory was the cause of death for all of them, and God's power broke them not by the strength of heroes, but by that of the weak. The famed giant died like a dog, felled by a shepherd boy's sling. The din of trumpets shook down the famous city. The renowned and haughty king lay dead on the sand of the shore, and the riches of the kingdom were equated with his naked corpse. This is lovely. So wherever Christ is with us, a web is a wall. For the person without Christ, a wall will become a web. It just fascinated me that somebody would write a poem off of all that. It was interesting. Okay.
Those last 2 lines again.
Okay.
About the web and the wall. Those are great.
So I know, right? This is what made me finally decide to bring it in. I was like, I like that last bit. So wherever Christ is with us, a web is a wall. For the person without Christ, a wall will become a web. It's good. It's good stuff. Tell me about your thoughts on Jericho and Holy War. Yes.
Well, we talked about people putting rocks as a remembrance in different places. So maybe Jericho was a pile of rocks when they finished, and that would be that. God's, a monument, of rocks to God, and that's why no one would ever live there because it's a place dedicated to God.
Ooh, I like that. Good thought. Good insight.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there any documentation as to what the people inside the walls of Jericho were thinking, seeing?
Not that I've ever read. I don't know if anybody else has come across anything. I can guess.
I mean, there's definitely some action going on out there.
Yeah.
I guess you could assume that Rahab would be the only one that would really record it.
True.
Because everyone else dies, and if anybody recorded it while it was happening, it's all gone.
Mm-hmm.
So Rahab would be the only one.
Marie, I've got 2 questions for you.
I have no answers for you, Pastor.
You got plenty, I'm sure. First,
Okay.
you may have mentioned it, I may have missed it. Is there any definitive idea of which God the people of Jericho worshipped?
I don't know. Nothing that I saw specifically. I mean, the Baals were everywhere, but
Right.
I don't know.
Okay. There just seems to be sometimes certain gods that God really says, Yahweh says, okay, I'm gonna, you know what, you're extra bad, so I'm gonna really get you to make a point.
Yeah.
Then my second question is, I want your opinion.
Okay.
You said it was known what happened at the Red Sea, and what happened here, what happened there. So do you think that people like the people in Jericho resisting the Israelites is by default resisting God? I mean, that's just what they've done in that action. Because you seem to point out very well that it's their wickedness
Yeah,
that moves God to destroy them.
yeah,
So is Israel coming to them, that last call for, look, you need to change, and you know these people are gonna wipe you out,
Yeah.
so what are your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. This is where we need to make sure we separate out things like the conquest of the Holy Land versus what happens in the Crusades, the Inquisition, these other things where people take this book and manipulate it to their thoughts and opinions. This was a very different situation. When you see the ark leading the way, God is clearly in the midst of this and moving it along. And so, yes, I think because this is clearly God's doing, the Israelites look so different from everybody else. You knew them when you saw them. I have to believe that when you saw them, you saw they were stamped by God in lots of different ways. And so, yes, in a very simple answer, I would say yes. When you're resisting the army, you're resisting God.
We read other places when you study, we talked about like maybe Deuteronomy needs to be the next book we really do.
That one's
Because
tough.
when you read before they enter the promised land, and I think we've mentioned this, they have skirmishes and fights
Yeah.
with other people. And when they enter the promised land, they have already assimilated a group of people who have chosen to be part of the people of God from whatever way. So we are assured, I feel like, that God has given everyone in that area an opportunity to life. But the choice is not just life, the choice is life in a monotheistic world with Yahweh as their king, Yahweh as their God, and no one else.
Right.
So when we get to the promised land, when we get to Jericho, when we get to the further places, I feel like we can assume that people had and are still being given the opportunity to accept or reject Yahweh.
It's true. It's true. We get all these notes all through Exodus and Deuteronomy about how to treat the foreigner among you, the sojourner among you, and it is always that you should treat them well. But the fact is they're there, so they've been picking up people all along the way. You're right. And they don't just pick up Rahab. We'll hear other stories before this is over of people. And in fact, that's how one of the ways Judges opens is a man from Bethel saying, "Oh, spare me, please. Your God is bigger." Yep. You are spared. Yes, he is, and you are spared. So, yeah. So short answer, yes. I do think that. For whatever my opinion is
This,
worth.
from Haley's, says just archaeological notes. Dr. Garstein, Director of British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem and of the Department of Antiquities of the Palestinian government, excavated the ruins of Jericho from 1929 to 36. He found pottery and scarab evidence that the city had been destroyed about 1400 BC, coinciding with Joshua's date, and in a number of details dug up evidence confirming the biblical account in a most remarkable way.
The trouble is they didn't preserve the site. That is what we've been finding, is that none of it was preserved. So all of that is pretty well lost. But yeah, they have found lots of destruction. That city was getting destroyed before it was Jericho. They have found archaeological evidence going way back.
Also, a part of that information is there is an interesting discrepancy of when the people, of about 200 to 250 years of when the promised land was actually taken.
Yes,
So there's an early date and there's a late date
that's
of
true.
about 250 years. So if you look at anything at the late date, that may not be Joshua, it may be what was rebuilt, but it may be assumed as the late date. The problem is that things were not dated very well. So
Yeah.
we have a certain portion of the Old Testament that we know happened, and we can prove largely archaeologically, except there's kind of a gap time too, of, well, because dating was different then, because people sometimes didn't date very well, it could have been then, it could have been then. We have something that kind of proves around here, we have something that kind of proves around here, and then we have something that came kind of in the middle as well. So that's part of the reason that archaeology and biblical archaeology is so very important, because we want to try to more narrowly define our dates. So that's, it's a problem, a good problem to have, and also some of the struggle in regard to really trying to date certain things. And we're also talking about a land that is much older than our land. Much, much older than our land. It has so much history down deep.
Down deep,
That we
yeah.
have to keep looking at.
Yeah. That was, we've had a discussion more than once about the fact that Becky and I and Kyle, whether or not to dive into the part that this is labeled a historical book, because when you say that, you tend to go into it with a different mindset, like it's a history book you get in school. But the people who write this stuff are theologians, and they have a purpose. So chronology is a little complicated. The historical part, it's not meant to be, and in 1776, you know. And so that's one of the hiccups I run into, is I want to say these things definitively happened at this point because it's a historical book, and I have to break that away. It's kind of like when we were, thank you, Sandy Richter, when we were looking at Epic of Eden, and she said, I think it was Epic, where she talked about the dinosaurs and how if you go to the Bible with that question, you're coming to the Bible with the wrong questions. But it's kind of that same idea of that want and that need to prove everything really did happen. And there's an element of faith there that we believe Noah happened. We believe this story happened. And even if, I don't even want to go into the even if it didn't, it happened. That's how I believe. But we get tripped up on the historical side because this wasn't written by history professors. So that can trip us up sometime, because I had no idea until, I guess, when we went to the Holy Land, that there were two different date ideas for the taking of the land. And I feel like that was a discussion we had over there, maybe when we were at Megiddo or something. But anyway, the historical part is kind of a misnomer for our historical books.
They're important to know, because the beauty
Absolutely.
is that if you look at it historically, the history can prove the fact that the Bible and the
Sure.
people in the Bible are true people.
Yeah.
The reason that we read the book, though, is because we want to understand more about God.
Yes.
So the history is beautiful, but that was what we were challenged on when we were watching this video about Holy War, is the fact that our author he is telling a history story, but what he ultimately is doing is teaching you theological principles about who God is. And if we only look at it in a history thing, in a way of history, then we miss really the bigger picture
Right.
of what our theologian is trying to tell us about the character of God, the continuous and consistent character of God.
Yes. Good stuff. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Trip ups? Well, next week we'll be into chapter, is it 7 and 8?
Yes.
Next week we will be, Becky will be covering chapters 7 and 8. Let me close this in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks because you are holy and you are righteous. And we ask, God, that as we go from this place, we would spend some time with you, turning everything in our path over to you, asking for your guidance in everything that we do. That, God, as we understand more of you and we come to love you more, that we would not keep that to ourselves. When we go from this place, that you would put people in our paths who need to hear this word of encouragement, who need to hear that you are mighty, you are capable of breaking down walls, that come in all shapes and sizes. So may we be free and ready to share your name with all that we meet. It's in your Son's holy name we pray. Amen.